Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Well, the summer is suspiciously quiet, so not a lot of news to share. It is August. Things are more laid back than I'm used to. I have kept up with running, and I actually managed to do 13.1 miles with my running group last Saturday morning, which means I now have to start considering an actual half marathon instead of the running with pals version. But it was pretty awesome to be able to do that, not have any physical hangover or any issues outside of needing a ton of water and Gatorade over the course of the day. So that was part of a 31-mile week of running, which I also did not think I was capable of a couple of months ago. So that's pretty much all you get as far as personal stuff from Gil. No lightning strike on the house, nothing else of note going on. Now, this week's guest is also a runner, but we have not gone racing yet. And thankfully for you, we don't talk about running on mic because I understand this can be really boring to those of you who don't actually get out and run. So our guest this time is Christopher Brown, who has a brand new novel out this week called Rule of Capture from Harper Voyager. Chris was on last year to talk about his first novel, Tropic of Kansas, during my insane 4 guests in 3 boroughs of New York City day. It was much easier for me this time around. He was that day's only guest during the kickoff of ReaderCon up in Massachusetts. Now, if you remember last year's show, you'll recall that I found Tropic of Kansas to be absolutely amazing. Really wonderful dystopian science fiction novel. Reminded me of the stuff that I really dug as a late teen, just as the cyberpunk guys were kind of fragmenting into a bunch of different directions and discovered Bruce Sterling and a bunch of other authors. Rule of Capture, well, it's a prequel to Tropic of Kansas, and it's set in the same dystopian counterfactual world, but it doesn't have the 100-mile-an-hour thriller aspect of Tropic. That said, it is an amazing page-turner of a novel. Rule of Capture follows a defense lawyer who is trying to protect his clients and the Constitution in the face of a corrupt, deteriorating government that's going to lead into the world we see in Tropic. This guy is no Atticus Finch, more of a Saul Goodman billboard bus stop ad lawyer, but he gets drawn into a case that turns out to have significant repercussions. It's a thriller, but as Chris tells us in the conversation, this one pivots on the law, not the facts of a case, like other legal thrillers would. He really, in Rule of Capture and in Tropic, he creates an America where everything is at stake. And in this case, it's beginning with a rule of law and its imperfect guardians. Or, as he put it in his pitch on last year's episode, this one is like Better Call Saul meets 1984. Rule of Capture is an amazing novel. I burned through it in 2 or 3 days. Just couldn't get enough and can't wait for Chris's next work. Now, as caveats go, I neglected to hit start on the main recorder. So for the first 30 seconds or so, you get the audio from the backup recorder because I'm insane. And that picked up some of the sound of the rain on the window. So you'll hear a little tapping like that. But otherwise, that's about it. I do want to point out that this is the first, when I talked about the hiatus I had of about 5 weeks between podcast guests, this is the one that broke that that 5-week streak. So if I seem a little weird or not necessarily asking the sorts of questions I normally do, it's because I completely forgot everything I knew. Anyway, here's Chris's bio from the flap copy of Rule of Capture. Now, there is a longer version at his site, ChristopherBrown.com, and you should check that out because Chris has done a lot in his life, not just as a science fiction writer, but as a lawyer, as an environmental activist, as a business lawyer, his work on Capitol Hill. There's all sorts of stuff, which is, again, the sort of thing that makes it so interesting or makes him so interesting to me. And seeing how he kind of brings all of that into his fiction is just absolutely compelling. Here we go. Christopher Brown is the author of Tropic of Kansas, a finalist for the 2018 John W. Campbell Award for Best Science Fiction Novel of the Year. His new novel, Rule of Capture, the beginning of a series of speculative legal thrillers, is out now from Harper Voyager. He was a World Fantasy Award nominee for the anthology 3 Messages and a Warning, Contemporary Mexican Short Stories of the Fantastic. His short fiction and criticism has appeared in a variety of magazines and anthologies, including MIT Technology Review, LitHub, Tor.com, and The Baffler. He lives in Austin, Texas, where he also practices law. And now, the 2019 Virtual Memories Conversation with Christopher Brown. So when we talked last year, you were 1 year into Tropic of Kansas, and this is going to air just at the time that Rule of Capture comes out. Did you feel a second novel jinx?
No, I mean, not really. I think that it's funny. My friend Maureen McHugh, the science fiction writer, I saw her around the same time. Or I guess it was a little earlier. It was right after Tropic of Kansas had come out, and it had a decent launch. And she said, "Now, Chris, you only learned how to write that novel."
Yeah.
And so that's certainly true. This is the first time I'd written a novel on contract off of a proposal. Which was kind of a lot more outline than I'm used to, and a lot more schedule than I'm used to. So it was an intense experience in that respect, but a good one because it's a story about a lawyer at its heart, and having deadlines and the intensity of deadlines in the writer's head. When you're writing a story about a deadline-driven lawyer, you can use that energy for the purpose of trying to charge the narrative, and I think it worked pretty well that way. But yeah, you always approach these things with angst for sure. But knowing that you have a legal obligation to deliver something is helpful to summon what you need to make it happen.
We've all heard stories of authors who just can't deliver, or here's the advance back, or what remains of it. But I'm sure that was never a concern or fear for you as this thing was going, because it feels like something that's both personal and, well, a personal thriller for you. Did you feel a sense of that? Well, it's a world that you care about very much based on Tropic of Kansas, but.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that this book provided me an opportunity to do things with the character of the lawyer that are things that my evil lawyer twin might, if he had the opportunity, wish to do in real life. I mean, in that respect, yeah, it provided me an opportunity to kind of dig into the criminal justice system, which was something I was kind of involved with to a limited extent in the early years in my legal career. And then again in the years while I was working on Tropic of Kansas, in fact, and well, may I just share that story. I mean, while I was working on Tropic of Kansas, I got asked by a former law partner of mine, who was a trial lawyer in Austin, involved in judicial politics there in a state where, of course, we elect our judges. What a great idea! And he was a grand jury commissioner at the time. And so he invited me, he asked me if I wanted to be a grand juror, which a lot of non-lawyers and people who don't regularly work in this world are somewhat familiar with, but don't often understand that it's not just for a single trial. What a grand jury does is it sits for a period of time and hears all of the felony indictments that the county or whatever prosecutor wants to make. And so this was for a period of, I don't know, about 4 months, and it was like 3 half days a week. And you would go down to the county courthouse with 11 of your neighbors, a pretty diverse group of people, and hear all of these cases of how the criminal, that all of these, indictments that the prosecutors wanted to make off various arrests. And you really got a sense of how the criminal justice machine works, of how much inequality and injustice is deeply embedded in the law and in its administration, and you're there as a part of the machine. If you're doing it as a lawyer, the standard of probable cause basically that they administer is one that's sort of pretty low, and you don't have a lot of bandwidth to sort of turn the cases away if the facts are there. Oh, but you also can actually, on occasion find ones where it's not there. But you end up being an instrument of that machine. And so that really grabbed me and made me want to do something with that material. And I've done some of that in my real life as well. But the idea of exploring the kind of true dystopia that already exists in the legal system, of writing a story about lawyers that was not so much about the facts, which is really how most legal stories work, but about the law, and to play around with the idea of who are the billboard lawyers in dystopia, and I can talk a little bit more about that.
Because I just had Better Call Saul. You mentioned that as one of the Better Call Saul meets 1984 as your pitch for this one, and unfortunately, I was stuck just visualizing him the entire book long. I'm like, I don't care. I don't recall if there was a description of him, but Odenkirk is basically who I envisioned as Donnie.
Yeah,
Chemo.
There is not a physical description of our character Donnie Chemo in this book. It's funny, what happened when I was working, he appears briefly in Tropic of Kansas. And there is a physical description of him there, but I don't think it's one that is any longer accurate. I think that someone must have altered that billboard, because who ended up being the character in Tropic of Kansas or in Rule of Capture is a bit different. But while I was working on Tropic of Kansas, I was kind of writing my way through the middle, and I had and that's more of a kind of adventure novel, mixed with like a political dystopia and a little bit of techno thriller. And I had one of the characters that was on the road with our protagonist had gotten locked up in the Huskow, and he was trying to figure out how to get him out. And I happened to stop at a Starbucks, that day, or a coffee shop someplace by the side of the highway. And I look up, and there's a billboard for this very Austin sort of lawyer's billboard. Now, Texas is an environment in which lawyer ads flourish like prickly pear.
Louisiana's the same thing. When we go to visit my in-laws, every commercial on TV is someone getting sideswiped on I-90. This is the lawyer to call. I'm like, how dangerous is I-90? I don't understand. But yeah, it's just law ads all the time. You don't get that in New Jersey. So
no, especially Houston is really good. In Houston, they have this guy called the Texas Hammer.
I saw some John Oliver, I think, did a spiel about him and his son, who's the secondary Texas Hammer.
The little Texas Hammer. There's another guy out of Fort Worth who calls himself the Texas Law Hawk, which is just and he has the scream, and he comes in after the accident, and they're almost like self-parodies. The one in Austin, it's a very Austin sort of one. The guy is he's the lawyer who rocks. And he has dreadlocks, and sometimes he'll be wearing a black biker jacket. And if you go to his website, there's a video of him playing with his band, some kind of punk metal riff on Crime and Punishment. So anyway, so I was like, oh, what's the billboard lawyer like in dystopia?
Apocalypse?
Yeah. And so I don't know. And so that idea, and then it was having coffee with my editor, and he's like, well, what are you going to work on next? And I was like, I got a few ideas, and then I gave him this one, and I just gave him that elevator pitch, Better Call Saul meets 1984, and he was just like,
boom, your work here is done.
Yeah, do that, but give me 2 of them, right?
Yeah, how when you talk about that sense, going from techno thriller to a legal thriller, but one that, like you said, is really about the law itself. How much of a challenge was that? A, making that transition, and B, kind of breaking away from what legal thrillers, might sometimes be.
It was really hard.
Yeah?
It was really hard. I mean...
And keeping it plausible. I know you're inventing some law.
Yeah, I mean, one, I'm trying to write works of, I call it speculative realism. Okay.
As good as anything else.
Yeah. I wrote an essay for LitHub around the time Tropic of Kansas came out that was titled "Dystopia is Realism," and I believe in the premise. I argued there, and so I want to write a science fiction that's made up from the material of the observed world, right? That has a kind of naturalism to it. I am a practicing lawyer. I've been doing it for a couple of decades plus, and so I've got a lot of material there to work with, but I'm not I was not, when I set out to do this, someone who was deeply immersed in or conversant with the huge literature of lawyer stories that already exist. So I had to go and bone up. I was never,
Thoreau, Grisham, and all that stuff.
I had kind of, read one here or there. I remember I read The Firm. I think that came out right around shortly after I had gotten out of law school. And,
early 90s, I guess?
Yeah, and so I read that, and I thought it was really funny, that book, because I thought it was a great satire of, I don't know if it was intentionally so, but
I think that's the issue.
That story, the basic premise there is ambitious, earnest, young lawyer finishes law school, gets a sweet job with this very high-paying law firm, goes to work at the law firm, and it turns out that basically the entire law firm is a criminal enterprise. It is the mob.
Yeah.
And if you kind of took that with a kind of a subversive angle, I remember thinking that at the time, it's that is what it is. It kind of is the legal, the corporate capitalist version of the mob. It is kind of in service of, profiting from, taking from the earth or taking from other people or whatever. If you kind of look at it through radical eyes.
And paying for protection.
Yeah, right. It is. Yeah. And so I guess in a way it's kind of like taking that idea and really biting into it. Right. So I had to go and I read a bunch of lawyer stories, and recent ones, classic ones, and some of the really early ones, which are really interesting. And one of the things I learned in the process of that is that, most of the contemporary lawyer stories, and even the ones that I was sort of most excited in riffing on, are the ones, especially of kind of the 70s stories that are about, where, they're often about, think of The Verdict, that Paul Newman, which is a Paul Newman movie. There's a novel that's based on, which is kind of a Boston-based story where we're here talking today. The idea of the lawyer as the champion of justice, the sort of the thankless servant of fighting and doing whatever it takes to kind of get the truth out there, the kind of the servant of the underdogs, the person who makes the justice system do what it's supposed to do, which is to be kind of the safety valve for the wrongs that the machine of society does. But the idea that the job of the criminal lawyer is to get the innocent defendant off the hook, right? Perry Mason, all of those are all Stanley Gardner stories. And but I think if you go back to the deep roots of stories, there was this really kind of what I found to be one of the first, or among the first practitioners of this quirky genre, was this guy named Melville Davison Post, who wrote
It's a good name.
These stories, kind of like magazine stories, around the turn of the last century. The most famous one of which is called Corpus Delicti. And basically what the lawyer does in those stories is help people commit crimes and get away with them.
Yeah.
And I think if you really look at most American lawyer stories, that really subtextually, that's what they're about. They're about the person who helps us do something bad and get away with it, to kind of carry out the Balzacian premise that behind every great fortune is a great crime, right? And so this book, Rule of Capture, tries to take that idea but kind of politically invert it and say, all right, yeah, this is a story about a lawyer whose job is getting people who are guilty off the hook, but what they're guilty of is violating unjust laws, which really, to a large extent, is kind of how the current criminal justice system works in many respects, at least with respect to how it's applied to a large proportion of the population with kind of more minor crimes.
Yeah, I saw a site recently that it just gives an obscure crime a day, basically, to show you how you're guilty of not even misdemeanor level, but felony level something. You know, based on if somebody wanted to prosecute, they could probably.
Well, I think it's at Crime a Day, and that guy is I can't remember his name, but that's his Twitter handle, and it was an anonymous Twitter handle. He just kind of came public because he wrote a book about it. And at Crime a Day is he takes provisions of the Code of Federal Regulations and couples them with other statutes or regulations to show how you can, create the wrong kind of cheese and be committing a federal felony. And some of them are humorous and some of them are scary. So, but I think it's right that there are a lot of things that are criminal that should not be. And if you decide what you want to do is imagine the most dystopian iteration of the American criminal justice system, or of the American kind of system of political controls coupled with the justice system, it's not very hard to do because you can just draw from the material of real life. And so, like, pretty much all the law in this book, I went to the University of Texas Law Library not far from my home and researched it. And you would be astonished how easy it is to find how many volumes of text there are, somewhat dusty, but treatises on the domestic administration of military or martial law in the U.S., usually written by military lawyers, typically writing in the time, between the kind of peak of the Industrial Revolution and before the 1930s, when martial law was a frequently invoked tool by governors to suppress labor actions. And they would, call out the National Guard. And so the same tools that were used to, say, administer, control over the population in the Philippines, after we had occupied it, were used back home. Usually applying, lessons learned by the same lawyers who had worked for the Army in both places.
Yeah, the guys who write the memos.
Yeah, the guys who write the memos.
Yeah,
exactly.
Because you do have a line in the book that there's no real law, just raw power dressed up in a tie. And I think back to for me, weirdly enough, the first, I won't even say thriller, but legal novel I read, there was Bleak House first, Jarndyce versus Jarndyce, but William Gaddis's A Frolic of His Own, which it's all civil stuff, but opens with a line, what was it? You want justice, you get that in the next world. In this world, you get the law.
Yeah.
But that sense that power is ultimately what defines us. And we talked about this a bit last time in terms of proximity to power and politics. We got a little bit into Aeschylus at the time, but this borders on Thucydides and going way back with the Greeks. A lot of experience reading that stuff, or is it just, you're a natural inheritor of those principles of justice versus power? Or justice,
I think, if you dig into, a lot of different angles from which a lot of different threads of source material and thought from which I'm drawn and coming to that point. Because, in a way, this book, Rule of Capture, is an effort to
invalidate the very underpinnings of law as we know it. But that's later in the book.
I don't want to write a legal thriller that's about the law, right? So most, like I said, most stories about lawyers are just about the facts. They're kind of dressed up versions of detective stories in a way, or crime mysteries or whatever. science fiction, there's lots of law. Asimov's Law of Robotics, or like the Philip K. Dick story of Minority Report, where people are being prosecuted for crimes before they've been committed, right? Even like The Island of Dr. Moreau, it's like the law that applies to the chimeric animal-human hybrids Dr. Moreau creates is kind of the core of the book in a way. But science fiction, there are never any lawyers. And so by marrying these two genres, you can kind of like take that science fictional notion of like you can allow an idea into a work of fiction, right? And in a legal story, attacking the kind of the law, you basically, the setup is that the law is like totally unjust and you got to figure out a way to kind of game around it. And so, yes, Aeschylus and others are, one source. There are all of these great kind of ur-texts, at least in Western literature, about the formation of legal systems, in the Oresteia. The kind of final scene, is the story of a blood feud, right? In a society where, there's no law sort of regulating the behavior of these characters. Who are avenging the murders of loved ones, and in the end, what happens is Athena traps the Furies, these sort of representations of the spirits of human vengeance, in the courtroom as the kind of the foundation of the justice system, and sort of like domesticating the spirits of vengeance. There's Njal's saga, which is, one of the great Icelandic sagas, written probably, like in the, 11th or 12th century, about events that had occurred a couple hundred years before during the settlement of Iceland. And basically it's the only story certainly the only Icelandic saga I'm aware of that's almost entirely focused on a lawyer. A medieval lawyer named Njal, who's a guy who they gets made fun of by the other Vikings because he can't grow a beard. And again, it's a story about settling blood feuds, and it's about these, in medieval Iceland, there really was no government other than like once a year they would all get together and have this sort of quasi-judicial gathering at the Althing and kind of settled their disputes. So playing with that material. But also, I studied a lot of legal history in law school and still read a lot. And more recently, as we talked about when we were talking about Tropic of Kansas, I'm very interested in kind of contemporary environmental things. And I really wanted to dig into the way in which, as I tried to articulate in Tropic of Kansas, I think when you really kind of dig into the deep roots of it, so many of our social, political, economic, and other problems, injustices, are rooted in the damaged relationship we have with the land, with the things that we need to do to kind of extract our sustenance from the land. And if you dig into the legal regime that articulates how we do that, if you dig into the stuff that you learn in, the first class you take in law school, which is property, which is really about real property, you kind of chisel through it, and there's, libraries full of lengthy tomes written by smart people explaining, how the current, owner of a given piece of property comes to have that as a defensible right. But that really, when you dig all the way into it, you usually end up finding some act of theft.
It's a line I used in the show years ago. My hometown in northern New Jersey, established 1742. The handbook they gave to the town back when I was a kid had some line in it with, it wasn't Indian, Native American settlements, but it was a hunting ground for the Lenni Lenape. But with the arrival of the settlers, the Indian way of life had to come to an end, is how it was phrased. And I was, at the time, you just kind of, hey, maybe there'll be some arrowheads in the soil. Yeah, as an older person, you realize, it was euphemism for how we got rid of all the Indians. That's not really cool. But that's... Yeah,
that's right. So I'm trying to dig into that. I mean, if you take like a class in Anglo-American legal history. You know, basically most of the common law system has its roots in the code that William the Conqueror and his lieutenants established to exercise their dominion over England after they conquered it. And obviously in this country, I mean, you go back and there are these cases, you know, that try to grapple with these issues. The early Supreme Court, you know, Justice Marshall, the famous Justice Marshall, who is sort of beatified in American, you know, legal culture as the sort of the father of the idea of judicial review and of kind of the core competencies and functions of the Supreme Court. And, you know, there's this case where called Johnson versus McIntosh, where the basic issue was a pretty simple one. As to a very large chunk of land, basically half of what now are the states of Illinois and Indiana, who had the defensible title to that land. The people who had bought it from the indigenous peoples who had lived there for many, many generations and had like an actual contract, or the people who bought it from the later sovereign, the United States of America, that had kind of conquered that territory. And Justice Marshall goes through this long kind of elegiac story about the sad plight of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, kind of walks right up to the issue that, you know, clearly by any kind of rational application of Anglo-American notions of law, the person who owned it before is the one who has the right to sell it.
Except,
well, the conqueror, you know, always wins. And so, yeah, in the end, kind of might is right. And I just saw, you know, recently an excellent essay by Rebecca Solnit talking about exactly that issue in the context of the Jeffrey Epstein case and some of these other instances of contemporary ways in which, in a very different context, power is exercised in a way that's unlawful. And
did you see that Alex Acosta resigned today?
I did see that. Yeah, I was actually tweeting about that today and suggesting that I went and looked in his last retweet. His last tweet was something about the Dow hitting 27,000 for the first time. And I was just like, oh, what'll happen here is this guy is just going to go, you know, like revolving door into some sweet seven-figure gig as a partner at an AmLaw 100 firm, and you know,
he's not going to be suffering by any means. He's just not going to have a cabinet seat. So
and you know, and it's like, should that happen? You know, should people who write memos that conveniently say it's okay for us to practice torture in violation of the Geneva Convention, you know, be able to go get Cush professorships at leading law schools.
Should Sean Spicer be invited to Harvard?
Yeah, I mean, those are some of the kinds of issues that I'm trying to grapple with here. Yeah. The guys who write the memos, like you said.
Well, hypothetically, you're a trade association executive and a lobbyist, and you're on a long,
asking for a friend.
Yeah, you're on an escalator on Capitol Hill, directly behind Brett Kavanaugh. What do you do?
You make the sound of a beer can opening.
Okay, so is it no shove, no. Okay, just.
I don't know.
Sure.
I mean, there's a scene in this book where our character goes to Washington, and he is confronted with the question of when you meet the enemy, the person you think is really like the demonized, the embodiment of political evil. Do you shake their hand? And it's kind of like, yeah, we always end up doing that. You know, that most of it, there are all these little small capitulations that we do that lead to the sort of domestication of evil.
I will say I was on the Acela on swearing-in day earlier this year, going down to the Hill to see a couple of congressmen. And the governor of New Jersey got on the stop after me. He's sitting almost across from me. A passenger walks up to him. Governor, I didn't vote for you, but I want to say it's an honor to meet you. And I looked at him like, who who says that? Like, who tells him he didn't vote for him but still wants to shake his hand? Just shake his hand.
Well, he's right. He's a constituent. It's a democracy. He's the people. I think that's okay.
Just a little weird, though, with the, I didn't vote, so I want to make you feel like an asshole. But let me shake your hand, too. That's So, yeah, I just walked up to him directly and pitched him on my trade association, healthcare in New Jersey, blah, blah, blah. But, yeah, that was a...
This was the governor or Kavanaugh?
The governor. Governor. Kavanaugh, I did not say anything to. I also didn't tell my wife or her very angry friends that I was standing directly behind him on a long escalator, because they probably would never have forgiven me for not, giving him a shove. But anyway, that's.
What did he look like in person?
You knew it was him instantly. Just that sort of expression. He's lanky.
I once got in an elevator in the Hart Senate office building with Warren Christopher.
Oh, I remember him. The not Secretary of State.
He was the Secretary of State for
This
Bill
is your
Clinton.
way of saying that? Yes, it was pre-Madeleine
And I
Albright.
remember thinking, like, that dude looks just like a Muppet. Or maybe like one of the puppets in that old Kukla, Fran, and Ollie show.
Yeah.
Sometimes you see people and they're like real person is even,
or they look like Spitting Image, those UK
Yeah,
puppets with
totally.
totally carved.
Everybody looks like their spitting image.
Yeah.
In the same way that all Ralph Steadman drawings look like real life.
Yeah, you realize it's actually, not just splatters. But do you have a legal hero?
I mean, I don't know that I have legal heroes.
Because usually I ask literary heroes, but I realize in your case it's a completely separate life. And
I mean, yeah, I have legal heroes, but they're like, none of them are people we know of. They're like, my legal heroes are the lawyers who don't go for the jobs in the big law firms, who don't worry about, how fast they can pay off their student loans, or who make smart choices at the front end about not having to get so indentured that you're stuck kind of working for the machine. And who are the people out there doing, day-to-day grinding criminal defense work, or appearing in front of these immigration courts, or working in legal aid clinics. And I have friends in Austin who do that kind of work. I do some of that, on a pro bono basis, and I have my own solo practice, and it affords me the ability to take on a few cases for people who can't afford to pay the fee. And that, to me, those are my real heroes. There are lawyers who are more public figures that I think are really interesting in a lot of respects as sort of models for the kind of thing I'm talking about. And some of the ones I had in mind were, William Kunstler, Bill Kunstler, who defended the Chicago 7, and is kind of a prototype of a paradigm of the kind of somebody who goes from being kind of a more white shoe lawyer to being like a people's lawyer. Yeah. I saw, and I think there was a documentary I saw that his two daughters had done about him, that two of his daughters had done about him, that I saw, like while I was working on Tropic of Kansas, and I think that had a big influence on this book. Along
with Better Call Saul, of course.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of Better Call Saul, I love the idea of
trying to use the law, but
still. Yeah, I love the idea. I mean, it's fun to play with. People think of lawyers as liars. It's fun to play with that a little bit. I mean, because, lawyers, zealous advocacy is, one of the tenets of the job. And I think that playing with that is fun. Yeah. I try to do it in a way that differentiates it, that's a little different. But the idea of, like the character who can kind of talk their way out of anything, or almost talk their way out of anything.
But is self-destructive enough to talk himself into some major problems also with your lead. So.
Yeah. And then there are, the lawyers who defend
clearly
war criminals.
Yeah, so clearly guilty scumbag horrible people, but their clients, I mean. But
there's a French lawyer whose name is escaping me right now. And I'm not going to go pull my phone out and look it up. But there was a French lawyer who died a couple of years ago who was famous for defending, like
Milosevic, guys like that.
Yeah, and like making a practice out of it. And I watched a documentary about him. He's pretty interesting. The kind of guy who would like defend, like, Carlos the Jackal or whatever. But
because everybody has a right to a legal defense.
Yeah, and then it's funny, like fictional lawyers. I had never, like, I remember when I was a kid, like Perry Mason would be on in reruns. And I was just like, that is like the last thing I want to watch. It's like black and white. It's like about lawyers. It's just like, I'm going to fall asleep even at you talking about it. But I was like, oh, I'm going to check this out. Because, at the Harry Ransom Center in Austin, among the things they have in their special collections is the entire personal effects of Earl Stanley Gardner's, the author of the Perry Mason novels. And for a while they had on the upper floor of one of the main libraries, they had his entire backyard writing hut assembled with all of his stuff in it as it had been, at his death, but with one wall removed, so you could kind of go in it. So I read a bunch of those, and I watched some of those shows, and they're really interesting, and they if you go watch like the first season of Perry Mason, the opening title sequence encodes like the secret of lawyer stories, which is about I'll describe it. So the opening scene is with the kind of creepy dun-dun, the music kind of comes up, and the scene is there's this sort of laconic, kind of officious-looking judge sitting at the bench, and the lawyer has his back to the camera. And the lawyer presents some document to the judge, and the judge kind of looks at the piece of paper, and it's obviously like a piece of evidence that's being offered or something, and the judge is like, okay, I'm gonna allow that. And the lawyer, who turns out is Raymond Burr, Perry Mason, turns around to the camera, and he's looking down at the document he's just gotten the judge to admit. And then he looks up in the direction of the camera with this clearly like demonic grin on his face. Yeah. That he has just done something kind of wrong. He has like tricked the system, and that's his job, and that he's, in the premise of the series and of the stories, he's doing it in the service of justice, in the service of a kind of, exculpating the innocent. But I think there's material there that, in an era when every day our news feed is full of lawyers in suits parading around in front of us, exhibiting varying degrees of moral rot that and ethical compromise that can only further and further, disappoint us beyond points we ever thought possible. Just like the idea of these, sort of standards, ethical standards of behavior that certainly among lawyers we're trained are kind of the heart of the matter. It's like I was just reading how the hallowed David Boies, who if you kind of came up in the 90s and as a lawyer, he had the Microsoft antitrust case, and then he had the
Al Gore was
he represented Al Gore in the Bush v. Gore case, and then together with his conservative tag teammate Ted Olson, he they got the Supreme Court to validate the constitutional right of gay and lesbian couples to marry and so on. And then it turns out he's the one who's like defending, he's like, he wrote the memo he signed the contract with the Black Cube guys who did the cover up in the Weinstein case. Trying to grapple with like a culture that produces that kind of failure of norms to work.
Have the last 2+ years, well, I know they've made dystopia easier to write about, but at the same time, have they given you more or less, I'd say, respect for power of the law? Given something like seeing the census question get knocked out ultimately by the Supreme Court, and seeing a president who clearly wanted to put this question on the census anyway, but backing down at this time yesterday. Any faith in the judicial branch? As we know it?
Very little. I was thinking about it. I was kind of like, is like this Michael Avenatti guy, is this like the best we can do? Is this the closest thing to a heroic lawyer we can like? We're like looking around for, where is Atticus Finch when we need him, right? Where is that character? And that character is nowhere to be found. And what astonishes me, as somebody who kind of started out working in Washington, and I worked with lots of people on both sides of the aisle, as they say, is just how, like, malleable people's principles are. It's just like, you got to be kidding me. Like
seeing the people who actually bailed on the census thing for the government to the point at which they were going to they wanted to assign a completely different team, at which point the judge was like, no, you can't really change your entire legal squad before this. It struck me, I don't want to say as principled, because maybe it was simply I cannot go up there and argue something 180 degrees from what I argued 3 days ago in front of this court. I'll be humiliated. And maybe that's it. It's humiliation as opposed to respect for the law that defines that attempt at standing up for oneself.
Yeah, I'm pretty cynical about it.
Yeah.
I think that, even you just take simple things like, economic policy and, these people who have been hammering away for 30, 40 years about, kind of free trade principles or kind of, neoclassical economics is like, that's the closest thing they can come up with a plausible utopian theory of the universe. And then it's just like gone. And in the legal system, what starts as this insistence on a resistance to judicial activism to a kind of like, from a political theoretical standpoint, defensible idea that judges should just apply the law, not make the law, right? Just a steady and pretty quick drift into some transparently results-oriented decisions and holdings and opinions, and you can see them there in the reasoning in the cases, which get increasingly kind of overtly political. And just the politicization of the whole judicial appointment system. It's pretty transparently screwed up as a system. So in your comment earlier, you mentioned proposal was for 2 books. Do we have a second Donnie Chemo story coming? Yeah. So the book I'm working on now, which I hope to be finishing soon, is not yet titled, but it's where rule of capture is. You can't use inherent vice. Pynchon already took that one. You don't do maritime law, anyways. Yeah. Oh, actually, it does come up in rule of capture. That's right. There is a maritime. I think there is some. Yeah. We've got everything. Something in there for everyone. Where rule of capture is about a criminal defense lawyer in a dystopian USA, or a USA drifting into kind of totalitarianism, defending people in front of a kind of a secret court and finding himself, transformed through stress from the kind of servant of the machine to somebody who fights against the machine, right? The new book is my effort at a utopian novel. Mm-hmm. But you alluded to the last time we spoke that you were still trying to formulate that vision for all of these books. I don't go to these dark places because they're fun to hang out. They're interesting, but it's just like you have to put you put a mirror up to the world you see, and maybe you kind of focus in on certain aspects of it and bring them out. Kind of like a radiologist might focus in on the problem in the X-ray and try to find out how can you fix that problem. And that's what these books are trying to do in a kind of deep thematic sense. But so I'm writing a utopian novel in which the lawyer is defending people who are being hauled in front of a post-revolutionary justice tribunal, right? A kind of, truth and reconciliation commission, as it were. And I think there's really interesting material there. There are a lot of people in like science fiction playing around with material like this a little bit. There's 2 really interesting writers, a woman named Ingrid Burrington and a guy named Brendan Byrne just did a really interesting epistolary kind of speculative fiction project called The Training Commission, that takes place in a near future USA in which a bunch of crazy stuff has happened, including kind of like AI running the state. And but there's been a kind of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission after things fell apart. And there are a few other writers doing stuff like that. But this is, I'm trying to find my way to utopia. Utopia is a place that doesn't exist. But I think utopian political theory and utopian thinking is an important part of our political discourse. And it's one that's been missing since, the late 80s, since the end of history. And so, it deals with a lot of the same themes. And we were talking about earlier about, how do you bring the blood feuds to an end? How do you create lasting peace in a society? And trying to think about putting a mirror up to some of our current, we're sitting here talking politics in a way that's sort of clearly revealing us as having a particular point of view in a way in the context of contemporary day-to-day headline reading conversations. But how do you get back to functional, healthy community, And so trying to wrestle with issues like that, while telling just an entertaining story.
Yeah, that's the one thing I want to get across to people. Rule of capture, for all of the legal side of it, is thrilling as all get out. I read it in 2 days. I just burned through the thing because you managed to wed the page turner, even though this one, unlike Tropic of Kansas, doesn't have the thriller chase side of things. You managed to integrate that really well. Do you have influences on that side in terms of I don't want to say pot boiler, but the page turner qualities?
I suppose I do in a way. That doesn't come easy to me. I am not a plotter. I do not write. I wrote pretty good book proposals for these books. But what ended up being the final story was pretty different from what I had initially anticipated, because these are really, at their heart, these are character-driven works of fiction, and I'm trying to write them with some sense of fidelity to a kind of literary truth, if that doesn't sound too pretentious.
It does, but it's okay.
But I have this character, a pretty good idea of who these characters are, and I kind of start with them, and I sort of start with the basic situation, and then find my way into how to, tighten up the hinges and pull the narrative cabling more taut through the process of revision, and find my way into that kind of tightly plotted story. In terms of exemplars of that, the best is probably the crime novels of Elmore Leonard, who I think very much took that approach, in my estimation, starting with character and a simple situation. That Get Shorty. That's a great novel I read, I don't know, 20 years ago or something, but it kind of starts with, clearly you can tell, he just starts with that character in this kind of basic situation. Yeah. And it's
what happens if
this minor mobster leaves his jacket at the restaurant?
There you go.
And just kind of finding your way into a story that evolves from that. So that's a pretty good example, and there are others in science fiction who've influenced me in a similar regard. So, but
anyone you're hoping to see at ReaderCon? This will air a few weeks afterwards, so nobody's going to know that you talk crap about them. But anyone or did you have someone you met at a past ReaderCon that was one of your holy crap moments of, oh my God, this is?
Yeah, ReaderCon is amazing. I always meet incredible people here.
Been recognized yet?
I have been, yeah. I get some of that. But I love hearing John Clute talk.
Oh, yeah.
I think he's one of the smartest humans walking the planet.
He thinks I'm smart, but I just shut up and let him talk when we record and pretend. I just nod no, I get that, John, completely. And yeah.
And I was on a panel this morning with Elizabeth Hand, who I think is just...
Have you read her new one yet?
I have not.
It's right over there. We're recording on Sunday. It is so good.
All right, awesome. Yeah. Today I saw somebody I really wanted to see here, who was L. Timmel Duchamp, known as Timmy Duchamp, to her friends, who is another one of the like smartest people I know walking the planet, a novelist and critic, and the principal publisher of Aqueduct Books, the Seattle-based, I think you can call it feminist press, who has her novel last year, Cherchez la Femme, which was this one of the best books I read last year, an amazing work of kind of feminist space-based science fiction, really fascinating stuff, and who has this series Alanya to Alanya, which is this 5-volume science fictional story about a revolution in the U.S. It's been a big influence on me. And then lastly, I don't think he's here this year, but last time I was here, I guess, which was 2 years ago, I got to meet Samuel R. Delaney, Chief Delaney.
Yeah, he's not here this time around, but yeah.
And because I was thinking about this new book, I explained to somebody earlier today, which I thought I had on the way up, which is that this new book I'm working on, the kind of utopian legal thriller, what a term, is kind of like Better Salt, or kind of like John Grisham stuck in Dahlgren.
Which I'm sure Chip would appreciate. But at some point, we're going to have a conversation where we talk about our comics upbringing, but this isn't the format for it, because we could go on for like 5 hours.
We could, I could mention one comics-related thing.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm working on an essay right now about law and lawyers in science fiction, of which there's a lot of, as I said earlier, there's a lot of law, but not many lawyers. There's like one episode of Star Trek where called Court Martial, where there's like a, Perry Mason in space. But comics are full of lawyers.
Or Matt Murdock.
She-Hulk is a lawyer. Yeah. And there's a lot of lawyers in comics. And there's something interesting there. I don't know that I've honed in on what drives that, but I think it's kind of cool. Maybe it's because those stories really are all about a lot of those. I mean, superhero comics are at their root are about criminal justice, by and large, in their kind of origins. And so maybe there's something there.
I'm going to go back to the first podcast where I ever interviewed a lawyer about a legal book of his. A guy named Thane Rosenbaum in New York City had a book called Payback, and posited or suggested that victims and victims' families should have more of a say in sentencing, that revenge should actually play a greater role in the criminal justice system than it currently does. It was an interesting piece, and we talk from our Aeschylus background as to, vengeance has to be tied down for the sake of law and order, but is that something you contemplate? I mean... Or is it too prone to... I'll send you a copy of the book. It's...
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, I don't know if I buy that, but I think if you want to have a healthy society, people need to believe that there is justice and accountability for people who do bad things.
Yeah.
And I think that the problem in this society is that it's a real bottom-heavy system, that people without power are routinely locked up removed from the ability to ever participate in a successful way in the mainstream system from an early age for doing things that are on the
spectrum
on the moral spectrum of criminality, pretty trivial, while people with tremendous power tend to get away with a lot of pretty awful things, and so I think that's why, like I was saying earlier, in science fiction, you're seeing a tendency to, if all science fiction is about the present, people are starting to write about like truth and reconciliation commissions of the idea of justice, of part of what's driving this book is like, where is the accountability for the people who created and operated these torture programs after 9/11? a couple of the psychologists who designed the program were civilly sued and had to come up with a settlement, I think was the outcome. But beyond that, there's no culpability. And so I think there is a need for a system in which people feel in an almost participatory way, if not an actually participatory way, that there's some justice in that sense. But I'm suspicious of the kind of victims' rights things people are usually talking about in contemporary parlance are tied in with a kind of rigged system that I think has inequities that would make that problematic.
Last semi-serious question. Beto O'Rourke.
Yeah.
Was his great skill that he was just more charismatic than Ted Cruz, which, as we know, is really not that great a skill?
Yeah, I mean, I saw a great graffiti when I was when the campaign was still going on. It's still up. It's at the corner of Riverside Drive and Interstate 35 in Austin on a little piece of concrete, and it says "Lizard People for Ted Cruz." And I worked for the Beto campaign. I volunteered. I was one of the lawyers who managed the voters' rights hotline in the sort of early voting period, and then on election day. Learned a lot doing that. I don't know. I have friends who are working for Beto now. I would say this about Beto. I think, he's definitely more charismatic than Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is the kind of Ted Cruz is the kind of politician who pisses off members of his own party. His former chief of staff, Chip Roy, defeated a friend of mine, Joseph Kopser, in the competition for Lamar Smith's old seat.
Yeah, and is currently
doing the same kind of thing, right? And but I mean, I saw Beto. You know what Beto did? Beto, to his great credit, even though I feel like he's kind of gone on a vision quest and got a little lost now, or some of the things that are more problematic about his stature are coming out in the current context. But like before he ever talked about running for Senate, when he was just a kind of a new congressman, he and Will Hurd, his Republican ex-CIA agent neighbor from the neighboring district, they got stuck in San Antonio, snowed out of D.C., trying to get back to work. And so Beto had the idea to, let's rent a car together, the Republican and the Democrat, and, road trip through Texas and across America and, live stream conversations about how do we get past our partisanship. I saw a bit of that, and I was like, wow, this guy's got something going. But in retrospect, I think, looking back, one of the things I noticed is that Beto appealed to a lot of people who were people like Beto, kind of well-educated, middle-class and upper-middle-class urban Texans, because he was so like them. And he's kind of a product of a pretty privileged upbringing. And I mean, I grew up, kind of middle-class, normal Midwestern privilege at least, and have had a lot of good fortune. And I think that intrinsically limits how much you can really, your capacity to kind of fully understand what it's like to not have that privilege. And so I think in the end, that it probably doesn't make him any more charismatic than Ted Cruz, but maybe makes him not the most attractive as a presidential candidate.
I'm sure we'll find out in a few months as more of the debates roll by. But for now, I'm going to let you get on to our friend Henry.
Henry Wessels,
He has a reading coming up with a story he wrote apparently on the train up here today.
The best way to write a story is with a deadline.
As you prove with Rule of Capture, which I enjoyed the living hell out of, I would say I read it on a deadline, but it was 2 or 3 weeks ago. I thought, let me see. It might take a week to read Chris's book. And again, by the end of the next day, I was like, well, that's done. Okay, that was. I can't wait for the next one, of course.
And if I can succeed in writing a book that's a page turner and engaging while you're reading it, and then when you put it down, leaves you thinking about kind of bigger ideas and looking at the world around you in a different way, then I'll be very happy because I will have succeeded in doing what I was trying to do.
It's a success. Chris, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me, Gil. This was fun.
And that was Christopher Brown. His new novel is out today from Harper Voyager, and it's called Rule of Capture. You should go read that one and Chris's first book, Tropic of Kansas, right away. It's just great dystopian SF. Anyway, you can find out more about Chris, his writing, his legal work, environmental activism, photography, and everything else he does at ChristopherBrown.com, which is spelled just like it sounds, so I'm not going to go through the whole spelling. Now, he's active on Twitter at NB_Chris, N as in Nancy, and on Instagram as EbitDada, which is EBITDADA. He hasn't posted on his Tumblr since 2017, but there's neat photography there at whatthezeitgeistwants.tumblr.com. And I'm not going to bother spelling that out for you. There's links to all this stuff at ChristopherBrown.com, so you can go spelunking there. Like I said, Chris has had a really fascinating life, and watching him take those elements and spin science fiction out of them has been a joy this past year plus. And after we wrapped, I asked him, "So, who you been reading?" And if you want to hear his answer to that and get some extra conversation, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The second quarter 2019 episode went live recently and features an hour of book recommendations and fun conversation with Mark Allen Stamety, David Shields, Michael Carroll, Frederick Tutton, Ursi Soteropoulos, Caitlin Foisey, Seth, Nina Bunjevac, Stephen Guarnacha, Hugh Ryan, Bill Griffith, Boris Fishman, and Barbara Nessim. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I have all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode. I really do have to scan the last 100 or so and get those in. My secret project, which I've let slide yet again, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this one during ReaderCon in Quincy, Massachusetts. I got 2 other sessions in that weekend, the Kate Maruyama one that posted a few weeks ago, and the Liz Hand one I mentioned in this episode, which will air in October when Liz's new book, Curious Toys, comes out. Pre-order that book. It is so good. The whole weekend probably cost around $500 or $600 for hotel, meals, gas. I don't think there was much by way of incidentals. So if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Buzz Carter, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Kevin Katila, Jack Les Camella, Stephen Nadler, Barbara Nessim, Jim Ottaviani, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, Stephen Solomon, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, Armando Veve, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.